My name is Alexandra Hudkowski. I'm the curator of public programs here at the museum. And tonight, we are thrilled to be presenting you with a deeper look at Vues by artist Amie Siegel. She's one of the 25 site-specific installations in the current Making Home Smithsonian Design Triennial. And so here we are. I'm sure all of you got to see the work to my right here. But here we are in the Carnegie Mansion, specifically in what we call the Great Hall. And I mentioned the mansion because our presence in this room is a good example of a very beautiful interior with thousands of decorative decisions worth major questioning. Questioning is exactly what Amie and Professor Jasmine Nichole Cobb have done in their work investigating visual and social representation in material culture. Amie is known for her layered, meticulously constructed works that trace and perform the undercurrents of systems of value, cultural ownership, and image making. And Professor Cobb, who's with us tonight from Duke University, where she's a leading scholar of African American cultural production and visual representation, has published writings that trace the emergence of Black freedom as both an idea and as an image in popular culture. Joining them tonight as moderator is my colleague, Alexandra Cunningham Cameron, curator of contemporary design and Heinz Secretary Scholar, as well as co-curator of this incredible exhibition. I'm gonna hand it over to Alexandra next, and she can share a few details about the exhibition and kick off this important discussion. But before I do, I need to send a few thank yous to the team at the museum here that helped make our programs happen: Alexa Griffith, Lily Cruz, Seamus Adams, Kosif Ray Chin, and the following supporters of the exhibition and associated public programs. Who are? It's a long list, so bear with me. Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, American Women's History Museum, National Museum of the American Latino, Asian Pacific American Center, the Henry Luce Foundation, the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Lillie Auchincloss Foundation, and ReArc Institute. This is just one of many Making Home Smithsonian Design Triennial programs. The show goes until the end of fall of next year, and we have multiple programs a month for all audiences, mostly here at the museum, but occasionally off-site across the city. If you'd like to know more about what's next, please sign up for our newsletter or visit our website calendar, where you'll find a constantly updated list, including our next program, a workshop on December 13th with Black Artists and Designers Guild. Hope you can join us, and let's get this started. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. And thanks all of you for coming. I see some familiar faces, some actual triennial participants in the audience, and a lot of new faces. Just a quick word about Making Home Smithsonian Design Triennial. I'm one of 3 curators. The other 2 curators are Christina De Leon, who's a associate curator of Latino design at Cooper Hewitt, and the acting deputy director of curatorial, and Michelle Joan Wilkinson, who's a curator of architecture and design at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we organized Making Home as a means of finding common ground around design through a topic that is quite familiar to many of us, home. And although we all have different relationships with home, we all have feelings and opinions and an understanding of home that served really as the basis of the 25 commissions that you see around this museum. And if you haven't had a chance to walk around today, I very much hope that at some point in the future, you're able to spend some time and maybe come back again, because as films and works like Amie's show, you need a good 40 minutes at least to totally dive in. Oops, 45, I need an editor, clearly. But the idea of teasing out the threads of the past that really weave into the present was an ongoing effort in the development of Making Home. And you see that play out in many projects across the triennial. It's hyper visible in Amie's double-sided work, Vues, which guides us through homes, public and private, across the United States, installed with monumental panoramic wallpapers that transmit in various ways the American struggle to achieve racial equity, among other things. The installation of this work in the museum's galleries has provoked really strong emotional responses. Visitors have often described feelings of creeping dread over complicity, frustration with the enduring presence of this wallpaper, anger at the recognition of domestic spaces as contested sites of labor and misrepresentation, and also awe at the moving beauty of centuries-old craftsmanship. But many also note a sense of release, if not relief, when collaborators like Joe Baker and Devon Tynes, who are both in the audience with us tonight, actively confront this paper in situ. And when we organize the projects of Going Home, which is the floor that you're on, the idea of interior design and architecture as containing signs and symbols that shape our values was one that really radiated many, many possible interpretations, which we'll see. And Professor Cobb's presentation will underline like how this expanse of racist imagery across US interiors and the important scholarship and dialogue happening to process their legacies. And Amie's Vues really poses a profound questions around race and national identity in the built environment, often in the background of our daily encounters. And so I'd like Amie and Professor Cobb to come up. They will speak to you about their work, and then we'll gather for a conversation to really tease out some of these ideas, and then hopefully have a couple of questions from the audience. Yeah, thank you.
Good evening. Before I begin, I just want to thank Amie for bringing me in to converse with her as she was making this work, and everyone at the Cooper Hewitt for staging such a wonderful event tonight and making space for this discussion. I have written extensively about Vues, or Views of North America, the English translation. And one of the things that initially drew me to the work was just sort of simple aesthetic attractiveness, right? The colors, how vibrant. It's a pretty object. When I first encountered the sheet of the wallpaper, it was given to me by a librarian at a Philadelphia archive. The late Phil Lipsansky, a researcher and librarian in Philadelphia. I was there researching racial caricature at the time, and as wonderful librarians do, he just came out with some unsolicited material and said to me, here's this. And it was a torn sheet of Vues. It was this section. What I was there to see and what I was writing about was a serial of racist caricature known as Life in Philadelphia. Racial caricaturist Edward Williams Clay illustrated Black freedom with a popular lithographic series. Life in Philadelphia, depicting free Blacks engaged in ridiculous forms of civic and domestic life. Clay's vision of Black freedom emphasized elaborate dress and improper speech to portray free Black people as foolhardy and self-important. His illustrations positioned people of African descent as ill-prepared to experience liberty or autonomy. Clay portrayed sightings of Blacks about town with the illustration of 14 colored lithograph sheets packaged in brown paper for viewers to enjoy in sequence. Life in Philadelphia expressed distaste toward wealthy, free Blacks by ridiculing their speech, their dress, and what Clay deemed as free blacks' unwarranted sense of self-importance. So I was at the library curious about these items in particular. In sharing them, I always like to make clear that the illustrator, Edward Clay, a white lawyer in Philadelphia, lived amongst a community of free black Philadelphians in 1830. So while the illustrations are ridiculous and by no means representations of actual people, they were inspired by the existence of a free black community and Clay's feelings about their existence. His original series, Life in Philadelphia, was so popular that it was reproduced in England. So the sheet you see to my right is the original, and the sheet on the left is the English reproduction. And when these items move across the Atlantic to England, they become refined in their portrayals. You'll notice the colors shift a little bit, but also the shading and line shift. They transform not just into single sheets for cheap enjoyment, but they're reproduced as books with binding. And so in the transatlantic transit of these images, I argue, they sort of elevate from lowbrow to high cultural materials, moving away from cheap illustrations meant to be consumed and discarded into things that would have been held for much longer. The ultimate home for those images, Vues, Deltil, the artist of Vues, designed the painting, which producers recreated in 32 different panels using 223 colors for what would become the scenic wallpaper, Vues of North America, for the company Zuber at Sea. The panel colors were applied with 1,690 hand-carved wood cut blocks to transcribe this panorama painted in the style of landscape paintings that were so popular during the period. So Jean-Julien Deltil creates Vues in 1834. So just in a few short years, the illustration that was Life in Philadelphia is transformed into something much more permanent, much more arduous to reproduce, hence the number of colors and blocks I'm referenced. It becomes a thing that's meant to be lived with permanently. This image of an exotic US landscape, a mix of race and republic culled together by the implementation of US democracy, became popular when the company reissued the item for home installation. Deltil's painted scenes of North American landscape as home to cordial race relations among whites, blacks, indigenous Americans, using 32 different panels in 223 colors, transcribed Vues into a scenic wallpaper that could cover a wall from floor to ceiling. In Picture Freedom, I argue that slavery's offering to visual culture was that of a peculiar ocularity, at once construing Black people as visibly deficient, but also invisible, invalid, and irrelevant to conceptions of nation. So in this work, I spend a lot of time with racial caricature. My point is that while these things seem absurd and crude, their sheer volume and popularity warrant further consideration about what was the work that they did in their popularity and their persistence over time. My argument here is that Picturing Freedom was a domesticating project that helped viewers of the Atlantic world maintain continuity across diverse notions of home through complicated illustrations of free Blacks. Central among these were pictures about Black people, used to sever the relationship between freedom and citizenship. So nasty illustrations like Life in Philadelphia help to accept the coming of emancipation by ensuring viewers that while people of African descent might move out of slavery, they would not move into a space of citizenship. In this practice, images such as Vues have been a site for the sedimentation of slavery's peculiar ocularity, at once relying on Black people's visibility and invisibility at the same time. Within that framework, I discuss Vues as an instance wherein the decorative arts were important for shaping a way forward for a nation actively construing a self-concept steeped in empire and struggling to reconcile the place of African Americans at the same time. So decorative arts helps consumers think of this young empire aspiring for greatness while still living with the unsettled question of slavery in the shaping of the nation. Decorative objects are materials we live with. Thus, their portrayal of racial difference and race relations is worth attending to. So central to this work and central to what I'm thinking about in our convening today is, what does it mean to live with Vues? And how does Vues represent the material struggle to place Black people within the nation? In my book, I talk a great deal about the 1830s context, which gives us life in Philadelphia and then Vues. So much of that time, America under President Andrew Jackson is steeped in racial animus, political violence, and active suppression of difference, even as that difference is so essential to the building of the nation. What I find intriguing about Vues is that it is timeless. It reemerges again and again through US history and does related but different kind of work each time. The spectacle of Vues served a hegemonic function at the 1960s White House. For instance, I've argued that the 20th century reemergence of Vues promoted as part of a White House strategy to counter the mediation of racial inequality and state-sanctioned violence against Black activists in the 1960s. Against the backdrop of a highly mediated struggle for Black liberation, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy resurrected the wallpaper as part of her White House restoration project and installed the material in the diplomatic reception room of the John F. Kennedy White House. Kennedy debuted Vues in a tightly managed campaign about her transformation to the first residence, which included a cover feature for a Life magazine story, as well as a televised tour of the White House for CBS. Some people have seen this before. You can actually find the full-length program online. For a tour of the White House with Mrs. John F. Kennedy, which aired on February 14, 1962, the First Lady walked cameras and CBS correspondent Charles Collingswood through the newly reconditioned home. For 60 minutes, she presented outstanding examples of American art and furniture, quote unquote, from across the country, which according to the Kennedy Library, she hoped would help viewers develop, quote, a greater appreciation for the history of America's most famous residents, end quote. An estimated 56 million viewers tuned in to the White House tour. So finding how this wallpaper ended up in the White House was a fascination of mine. And it so happened that at the time I was looking into how did it get there, I found many archival documents about how this was presented to the media, but also the hard work that was constructed around reinstating the wallpaper. So rather than buying a new edition of the material, Jacqueline Kennedy resuscitated the wallpaper from a home about to be demolished and placed that wallpaper in the White House. In those kinds of details, I am fascinated by how the project of the American home, as represented through the White House, is one of restoration, rescuing relics from demise, and what that means for the stories that those items tell. This historicizing aura of Vues continues It is here in New York City at the Yale Club, and there was a whole discussion about what to do about that. And then, of course, it found new relevance in the Obama administration once there was the first African-American president to stand before the wallpaper. In so many ways, the paper brings up questions about not just race in American history in the past, but also questions about taste making. What does it mean to restore an item, and how the culture of taste making interacts with notions excuse me, of race and belonging. I'm pretty sure that the Obama White House was aware of the legacy of this wallpaper, and in some ways interacted with that and acknowledged that through ways of staging the Obamas in relationship to the wallpaper. Where they're standing is exactly in front of Minta and Cato, the caricatured photos I showed you initially. So there's this way in which when we are faced with reimagining decorative arts like wallpapers, we are contending with the composition of items and the spaces organized around them, and not just what is represented within them. Thank you.
Jasmine spoke about Views of North America, which in many ways forms the basis of my project, Vues. And it is very much a double-sided project in the sense that it's literally a work that has two sides, and rarely we get to see the reverse side of a wallpaper, which is usually hidden. And of course, hidden things are always interesting to me. Revealing the sort of hidden social structures or economic circulations or peregrinations of objects and cultural materials, whether they're from the world of design or history or otherwise, or both in this instance. And so this double-sided work, I can speak about, I should say, so this is, it's lovely to be able to be standing next to the actual work, as you can see it through to my right and then projected here on my left. And this actual object came from a visit that I made, also together with Alexandra, to the Zuber factory in Rixheim in France. And it was a drizzly day, and we were given a tour of the factory. It's part of the research for this project. And then we were taken out the back door of the factory to go have one of those really long French lunches, right? And with wine and everything. And on our way out the back, I noticed on the right side there was a huge dumpster. And I could see rolls of paper peeking out from the top. So while everyone was sort of slowly making their way through the rain to the restaurant, out of the parking lot, I was peeking over into the dumpster, wondering what was there, and could see actually that there were quite a few rolls of panoramic wallpaper tucked inside. And let's remember that this wallpaper is, as Jasmine indicated, hand-blocked with these wooden blocks that are now national monuments of France, the wooden blocks. And they're part of the cultural patrimony of France. And, you know, to make a single set of the wallpaper takes weeks and weeks on end. It'll take months and months to be delivered to you. Yes, this wallpaper is still made, which is also fascinating. And that Views of North America was first made in 1834 on the same wood blocks. So they print it layer by layer, and it's incredibly expensive, something like $60,000 for a full set, and probably another 30 or 40 to install it in your home. And there it all was in the dumpster. So we went to lunch, and everyone is having lunch and having a good time, and all I'm thinking is dumpster, 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 dumpster. What else is in the dumpster? So when we came back, I asked for a ladder. And they very graciously indulged me, and we pulled roll after roll out of the dumpster and dried it all out on Zuber's long drying racks. And some of the material that I found was indeed
aspects or elements or panels of Views of North America that were incomplete. And so I had already planned to do something, to make a double-sided work that would have some sort of paper element on the other side, and was kind of in the process of, you know, convincing Zubair to do something with me where they would give me some wallpaper, but little did I know they would be giving me their refuse, basically. And just basically decided to reassemble this section, this very important section of a much larger span of the panoramic paper here. And it's fascinating in terms of course, what is left out and who is left out, and the kinds of reflections that are, cultural reflections that are embedded in it. So this is, and then of course, on the other side of the wallpaper, as you can already start to see in the mirror, in the reflection there, is a film that I made that's the 45 minutes we referred to earlier, which kind of takes place across a span of homes in the US that feature panoramic wallpaper, including, but not always or limited to, Views of North America. So panoramic wallpaper, as you can see in the background here, features a kind of imaginary, often idealized landscape. And I would say the most innocuous of these papers, like Views of Italy here, which is a grisaille, a black and white or grayscale paper, represent, you know, scenes in Europe, let's say. But the majority of papers, and the most popular papers, in fact, represent elsewheres to Western Europeans who created the paper and then sold the paper to various markets, particularly North America. And the American market became huge for them, in particular Views of North America, the, you know, Americans wanting to look at representations of themselves. But let's also remember this paper was made sort of at the advent of the July monarchy, when France is fantasizing a new vision of itself and looking at American ideals of democracy, and at the same time, America is still coming off of its Jeffersonian high in relationship to French culture. So there's a lot of kind of fascinating exchange there. So my film actually starts in Andrew Jackson's Hermitage. And you mentioned, you know, we're very embedded in this era in kind of Jacksonian America, and for better or worse. And this, of course, is the Hermitage, but in fact, this is actually a model of the Hermitage that is a miniature. So it's literally, you're looking at 1 foot equals 1 inch. And this is one of the throne rooms at the Art Institute of Chicago that seek to depict different eras of decorative style and history. So it's a kind of mise en abîme, or a kind of, let's say that an introduction that tells you that you are starting out in a space where the real and the simulated might be in a kind of constant and confusing conversation. I spoke about, so the film moves through different homes around the US, mostly in the East Coast, and then through the South, all through the southern parts of the US, including from Virginia all the way down to New Orleans. And this is El Dorado, another panoramic paper that's, you know, depicts a kind of imaginary land. And here's Views of North America in C2 in a home. This home in Virginia. Details of the paper and the spaces that they reside in, and how they themselves suggest, let's say, the kind of unconscious or Rorschach-like histories or spaces of the paper. So the paper is a kind of proto-cinematic device, meaning that it precedes the advent of cinema, and yet it also foreshadows or kind of foretells cinema in a way, in its long panoramic unfolding. It surrounds one when installed in a room, and also allows the person in the room to become a kind of armchair traveler, to go to faraway places while never, in fact, leaving the parlor, as it were, or the entry hall. And so the paper has within it a kind of ethnographic quality, almost a troubling ethnographic quality, I would say, of transporting those who could afford it to an elsewhere. And what interested me was also very much the spaces where these wallpapers were installed. So there's the elsewhere of the wallpaper, the landscape of the wallpaper, but then there's the landscape surrounding the homes where the wallpaper decorates the parlor or interior. And those spaces themselves were often plantations, not always, but often plantations, which included, large swaths of subjugated labor, slave labor, including Andrew Jackson's Hermitage. And so this is also something that is a kind of layer in the work itself, in the film Vues. And it also plays formally with the relationship between the film's own depiction of landscape and the wallpaper's depiction of landscape in several ways, several formal ways, one of which is literally to turn itself into a grisaille, into that gray scale that I mentioned before. So creating parallels between the landscape of the paper and the landscape where the paper is installed. And that's that grisaille in the interior. The paper is also, as Jasmine indicated, in private clubs. So the Yale Club in New York City or the Pendennis Club in Louisville, Kentucky. And there are also scenes in the film, these are all stills from the film, scenes of conservation. So interestingly, bringing up those questions about what it is that is being conserved and maintained in terms of the images of the paper, what they represent, and their place in the home. And our relationship, our American relationship, our great American project of conservation in relationship to American stories. What are those stories that are chosen, to be told, to be maintained, to be cared for, to even be treated like a sick patient at times, being nursed back to health? The project also includes, very importantly, scenes of collaboration and what I would even call resistance in terms of a sort of antidote to the representations in the wallpaper. One of these is a collaboration with Alcorn State University's marching band, the Sounds of Dynamite, who, those of you who've seen the film, have experienced moving through one of the homes featuring views of North America. In some sense, an allusion to the figures of West Point that are featured in Views of North America. A kind of surrealist moment that creates another sense of bodies in space, creating their own form of, I guess you could say, resistance, but in that sense, presence, I think, is most important. There's another home in the South, the Plantation House, featuring not just not just a panoramic wallpaper. In this instance, it's not Views of North America, but Views of Brazil, but also featuring a plantation toile on the chairs. So the theme of the plantation is carried out across multiple forms of textile covering or decoration. You can see on the right, very importantly, the presence of ships, like alluding to the transatlantic trade in goods and people as property. And then on the left, you can see the representations of slave labor depicted. It's an incredibly brutal paper, Views of Brazil. And interestingly, this one has a dado, a kind of that balcony line beneath. And I was quite fascinated by the fact that the plantation itself had a balcony or dado and created kind of parallel shots between them that move in the same direction to draw closer parallels to the landscape of the wallpaper and the landscape outside, which itself had similar scenes unfolding in its own history. Another collaborative scene in a New York City apartment is with the artist and triennial artist, the wonderful Joe Baker, who is part of the Delaware tribe of Indians and a descendant of the Lenape people, the original inhabitants of Manhattan and beyond, and the founder of the Lenape Center. Joe and I developed a scene together, and all of these collaborations were really developed as such, as collaborations, shared ideas that came forth, developed a scene together where he is placing cutouts of members of his community and his ancestors on the wall, on the wallpaper, in the spot where the quote-unquote indigenous people are represented in the wallpaper. That is another aspect of Views of North America. So it has representations of so-called freed people of color, but also representations of indigenous people. And I say that in quotes because they're, of course, a pastiche of ideas of indigeneity from that empire-building colonial era. So these are the images, like paper dolls, placed on top of the wallpaper. Again, the real and the fictional meet each other. And another collaboration with a triennial artist is with Devon Tynes, the wonderful Devon Tynes, whose piece is just beyond. We have a sequence of rooms here with my piece, then Joe's piece, and then Devon's in the room just adjacent, a kind of enfilade of ideas and collaboration that came about. And Devon Tynes, the amazing bass baritone, and I developed a scene where he would come into one of the homes that features Views of North America and perform. And importantly, this home is about 20 minutes from the very home that Devon grew up in, which he has recreated in the Triennial as part of his exhibition contribution. And he sings a pastiche of material derived from his piece, would you call it an opera, Devon, anthem? A concerto, his concerto anthem, and also other selections that he and I came up with together, a kind of pastiche of material. And the camera moves around him in 360 degrees. He's always depicted in this circular way as a kind of inversion with the wallpaper always in the background. And then we cut to the same 360-degree movement, but this time we're in the White House, but still listening to Devon as we circle the diplomatic reception room, which Jasmine spoke of earlier, and then head out the door to reveal that we're in fact where we are, the White House. I've really given you a kind of like condensation of the film. But in any event, thanks so much, and I'm looking forward to talking.
Yeah, where you feel comfortable. Amie, thank you. It's incredible to be sitting here with you. It's been a very long journey. I mean, many of the projects in this exhibition have taken years to come together, and it's beautiful to be sitting here with you. to hear you talk about a finished work in the galleries. Thank you. And Jasmine, as a co-conspirator in this process, the fact that you're here also sharing your research, which has contributed so greatly to what Amie has done, it's incredibly meaningful, so thank you. And I love that you shared your origin story with the wallpaper, with Vues of North America in particular. Do you want to share any version of an origin story of how you came to working with this material for this particular work?
No. No, I'm kidding. I do. I'm happy to. It's not as exciting, though, I think, as yours.
You can make it up. You don't have to tell us the truth.
I could lie. That's true. Well, I say it's not that exciting only because, in a way, as somebody who's interested in the moving image and in the panoramic, that was my entree, in the sense that I was familiar with panoramic wallpapers as such. Was also familiar with the wonderful piece that the New Zealand and Maori artist Lisa Rihanna made from the really, really troubling Dufour wallpaper, which is a very different approach and very amazing kind of animation of the savages of the Pacific Sea, as it's loosely translated, depicting her own country and Captain Cook's voyage there. So in some sense, I was aware of it and familiar with it, but I'm always interested in, as much as I love that kind of bringing to life that Lisa did, I'm myself very interested in where materials are in situ and the stories that they tell in relationship to the spaces in which they reside. And really, I think this project for me has eliminated entirely the boundary between museums and houses, because they're both spaces of display and cultural display, though houses are fascinating because whereas museums can exhibit and are often invested in the sort of ideas of cultural hegemony and the colonial project that so much of the West is obsessed with and invested in. But homes can also reflect very personal versions of stories, whether they're that story, the story of the colonial project, through a single family, or other stories that they want to put forth, that the objects have similar function. And the wallpaper, of course, is especially fascinating in that way, at least to me, because it's background material, as you said. It's what we choose to ignore for the most part. It's almost like sound in cinema. It's this incredibly important element that provides so much tone and space, and yet we kind of don't see it, as striking as that wallpaper is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Jasmine, you, in your sort of B-roll presentation, started to get into additional objects that are carrying this type of messaging. You included murals, you're thinking about objects in context, and I was really curious about your first conversation with Amie. I think it was maybe before you started traveling, right? Because Amie was also, to have been on the CC list of Amie's outreach was quite profound for me, because I was amazed by how far your reach went in terms of conversations and research and travel. But I felt like, in speaking with you across the project, that Jasmine's feedback was actually quite influential. And I wonder if you remember that conversation, Jasmine.
I do. We've had a few conversations, and again, I think we were always planning 20 minutes and went about an hour every time. But it was fascinating, and the more we talked, the more I was bought in. I think initially just knowing there was a project to be done on Vues, I was, interested, but we talked about venturing into the South to see these papers, entering into the homes where they still reside today. And so I felt very much like I was talking to someone as eager and concerned about the existence of these things. And so that was really important to me. And a question that I've sometimes gotten when I talk about Vues is, should it come down? And I don't know that we ever talked about that. There was so much sympathy between us about the handling of relics, the function of them, and how they are lived with, that I felt along for the ride with Amie, and that even though I wasn't going into some of the homes, I was always eager to hear back from the journey to the places and what she was finding and planning to do.
And it's interesting to hear you say, Amie, that you sort of went into this with this expectation of private domestic spaces and institutional spaces maybe having more of a delineation. Can you talk a little bit more about expectations that you went into this project with, into this research, into this work, that were disabused or evolved as you traveled, as you spoke to more people, as you dug deeper and saw the works in situ in these contexts?
Yeah, I think when I started out, I was very taken with, and still am, with the kinds of questions that Jasmine's research brought up. And in particular, I was really curious about how the project would bring forth this latent story behind Vues, the story of the clay prince and life in Philadelphia, the racist prince, and knowing I myself am somebody who's not very interested, well, that's not the right way to put it, but let's just say that I didn't want the work to have a voiceover or a narration. And I really wanted it to unfold in the present, even though sometimes it was depicting papers of the past. So I had this kind of question in mind about how would that, and it really haunted me. But then slowly over the course of the project, and especially when I started visiting the homes, the question started to be replaced by another question, which had to do with a whole other latency. And the latency was this great project of conservation and sort of maintenance of a certain era of decor and American history and the interconnections between them, and how that whole, the presence of that through the wallpaper and through Vues of North America, but through the other wallpapers as well, how that upheld a very particular, very white, exclusive, and also economic status version of American history. And so it was really interesting, that evolution, because I think that your research really was, for me, inspiring in terms of looking at what was behind things, which is something I'm also invested in, but somehow being able to carry that question was really important, and then to acknowledge the breadth of these other similar concerns in a way.
Yeah, something we didn't talk about, I guess we couldn't have, but we have a shared love of film. And so part of my delight in this project is what film can do as an interlocutor in this conversation. Your choice of angles, I'm assuming most people have watched the film by now, if you're here. The ways in which you give us information without voiceover, whether it's a UVA jacket from someone walking into a house, or we talked earlier about how you tell us at the beginning that we are seeing fact and fiction, right? That there are things that are tricking our eyes when we look at the papers as well as the film. And then to what I had a question about, but you've just answered, I think a really brilliant choice to offer movement and music to the representations of Black subjects in the film, which is such a wonderful corrective to what clay does, which is not only to fix Black subjects in place, right? They're stuck on the paper, but to fictionalize Black voice through malapropism in the paper. And so I think the film element, you bringing film to the conversation, to a conversation with the paper, is a really lovely contribution and corrective.
I'm thinking back also to, it's not that far back, but I'm thinking also of, and I hope I'm not disclosing anything out of hand, but you mentioned the question of should it come down, and I know that you've been saddled in particular with that question by people who have the paper.
Yes.
And I can imagine, how frustrating also that is to be turned into a professional for various reasons in that way. But at the same time, and at the same time, just the presence of that question to you kind of perpetuating throughout. I think for me, that question was really curious because, as I said before, it started out as, it's not something that was central to my project per se, but I found the question itself so telling.
Yes.
And so just knowing that, and knowing, for example, that the Yale Club is struggling with what to do, as was Brown at the time. Brown University also has the paper. I mean, so many places actually. I say so many, it's not ubiquitous, as we've discussed, and yet it's really surprising how many spaces, universities, private clubs, homes of a certain era, but also homes now, have deployed this paper, whether originally or have redeployed it in the sense that they've taken it up as a representation of the era that their house is in or seeks to represent.
Yeah.
So it was, I think that knowing that question was posed again and again to you, even when you would give a talk on the paper, was fascinating to me, because it indicates that there's a kind of neurotic, there's a neurosis to be dealt with, right?
Yes, a bizarre commitment to the maintenance of the thing, despite other anxieties it induces.
And maybe it's also missing a larger point, right? I mean, something that strikes me about your film is a repetition of a certain type of environment. And Jasmine, you talked about taste-making. And Amie, you're talking about context. And I wonder for both of you, whether beyond the wallpaper, there are other objects that repeated within the context of this power interior, or this interior that's reaching for a certain type of national pride and history and wealth or status or position. I mean, there's so many different ways to think about how interiors can signal. And I'm interested in talking about the wallpaper, but also the context of it. The wallpaper is part of a bigger constellation.
I mean, I could speak about those hideous canopy beds that, sorry, I mean, I shouldn't, it's like, I don't know why they're hideous, but
there's no judgment in interiors here.
But I think it's interesting that I call it that, because I think they became hideous to me because because of the spaces that I associate them with now. Like, I don't think I felt that way the first one I saw, but by the 15th one, I was really disturbed.
Like the droopy canopy?
Like the canopy that pulls to the center with this like knot at the top, and there's a kind of a silk. There is one in the film. It's a red one, but they're sort of these. I don't know the particular of it, but I saw them over and over again, and they're a kind of a status symbol of representing that era, and they were disturbing to me. But at the same time, I think they were disturbing because of their repetition and because of the kind of conformity to the era, and the sort of, which I'm sure for a lot of people has to do with ideas of temporal authenticity. But it's like you're choosing to show that, but you're choosing to erase other things. And that was, I think, that's why I think I'm using the word horrifying. But to really answer your question, Alexandra, I would say the most disturbing thing was to realize that people were property and people were objects, you know, and that you can see in the sort of lists and registers that appear in the films and the wills and the things like that, that are, the silver is listed and people are listed and they're in the same column. And that was really the sort of strangest thing of all, you know, in that respect.
Yes, I would agree. I appreciated that inclusion in the film to sort of remind us of objecthood in all its permutations. I think a material that I'm equally intrigued by and confounded by China and representations of people on China, which is interesting because it...
Do you mean China as porcelain?
Yes.
Okay.
What's interesting about those materials is that for the time period, they are both pro-slavery and anti-slavery. Anti-slavery sugar bowls and teacups and tea service and the like, while well-intended, still does some of this objectifying work that the film deals with, you know, making bodies and things interchangeable with one another through representation.
Yeah, it's interesting because it begs this question also about like, where do you draw the line? Because any object, you could probably trace it to some sort of problematic, complicated history. Like now it's incredibly popular in museums to talk about mahogany, you know, and like everything, even the Hogarth, you know, self-portrait it's only a discussion of mahogany, the chair that somebody sits in, you know, it's like very specific. And that's a sort of a curious thing because I think the importance of the wallpaper is it actually depicts the thing that, you know, that is, it's not just an issue of literal material culture in that sense of materials.
Yes, and I think the wallpaper begs our attention, especially, you know, your film is contemporary. These are contemporary spaces, that the objects are meant to represent the owners in much the way in enslavement people bonded represented their owners, or not, depending on the context. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it also makes me think about the tremendous work that you've done around the parlor, what you're calling the transatlantic parlor.
Yeah.
And, you know, I spoke about the idea of the armchair traveler earlier, but that idea that you put forth about that, you know, the way that the wallpaper kind of bounds and prefigures a certain Black domestic experience. Like it's both limiting and it foreshadows the sort of spaces that are become the enclosures.
Yeah, what becomes home, a domesticity and domestication all at once.
Yeah, and I think for me, you know, when you're reading something that's really engaging, as I was with Picture Freedom, with your book, you know, it's like you're imagining everything. You're looking at the illustrations of the book, but you're also imagining the spaces. And then when I got to the actual spaces, I felt like I knew how important the exterior landscape was because of reading, somehow paradoxically reading about your writing about the interiors, you know, in the relationship of the people who were outside and brought inside and so forth.
I was so pleased to see that in the film, the exteriors, because first it reminds us that they are conversant. The exterior, the walk up to the homes, the last few stills you showed of the chair rail and the porch railing, you know, they're reiterative in that way. So I think that is important. But also to think about how interior and exterior, it's part of the work of the paper.
Yeah, like it's so interesting that the paper's job was in part to bring exteriors
inside.
Yes.
And they were often installed in the entry hall
Yes.
as well as the parlor, like in Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, it's in the entry hall. In some of the other images I showed as well. But when you think about what was actually happening in some of those exteriors, you know, in those landscapes, you can imagine that it's like the ultimate suppression, because you have an completely fictionalized, idealized, beautiful world that you are gazing upon. It's a view upon, you know, something entirely different to what is actually outside.
Yes.
And in terms of form making for the film, I mean, Jasmine, I loved how you were speaking about what appealed to you in Amie's lack of voiceover or dialogue. I don't think you talked about some of the strategies you employed to think through the sort of connection between the interior and the exterior and the movement and voyeurism and long tracking shots. I mean, can you just speak a little bit more about how you crafted this experience, which is quite powerful in the experience of the film? And then I would love for you to just speak about how you chose this room in the mansion.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's funny because I've done a lot of parallel tracking shots, and just to say what that is, and you know, I'm sure everyone knows, but you know, a tracking shot is when the camera's, you know, moving literally on track on a dolly, and the parallel is maintaining a parallel movement to the action one is filming. And what's so interesting about them, what has always been interesting about parallel tracking shots to me, which aren't pans, because a pan is when the camera is fixed on the tripod but it moves around, right? But this is literally the camera moving in a parallel line, like a train track on a train track. Is that something is always coming into the frame. So you're always anticipating something. So they're sort of amazingly suspenseful, even if they're really slow, like mine. And they focus your vision, like they focus you on what to look at, and they engage you in the act of looking. You're part of it. You're not just like a kind of held like prisoner to what the camera is looking at. You're really actively involved, and there are multiple things to look at. So I've always been fascinated by that, and also there's like a kind of wonderful essay by Brian Henderson called Toward a Non-Bourgeois Camera Style, which I'm not going to get into, but that argues that staying parallel to the action means that the image is always an act of representation. It's not an act of psychological involvement, which would be moving forward, but I'm not going to go into that, even though I just did. But what's interesting is that I wouldn't say I was like tired of parallel tracking shots by the time I made this film, but I wanted to find something else, but then I realized that it was the word parallel that was important to me. That there was a way to parallel the landscape of the wallpaper and the actual landscape by mimicking the parallel shots between them. And then that liberated me, ironically, from the parallel shot, in that I started to do what we call like a boom up or a boom down, meaning that it's the same kind of slow movement, but it's going vertical rather than horizontal. But I would boom down the tree in the plantation and then boom down the tree in the wallpaper, so that you would understand that parallels were being drawn associatively between these landscapes. And you know, that is how I always want to work, is somehow associatively rather than explicit, in an explicit manner. And I think it's a kind of wonderful non-coincidence that we chose, essentially after much conversation, to use the former music room of the mansion to display the work. And I think one thing that's really important to it is that it has these empty spaces, these empty medallions that invite the space of wallpaper. But for me,
because the subject of the work is wallpaper, it was important, like it always feels important to me to alienate the material from its use, its proper use. So it would have been proper to install even my work on paper in those medallions, right? It would be like the obvious move. But in some way, I think the materials need to be taken away from their proper use in order to see them in a new light and to see them as an artwork, not as, wallpaper, just wallpaper, even though there are amazing wallpapers made by artists,
Yes.
including Joe's, which is right there.
Yeah.
I just want to say that your choice of shots, what I appreciated is that the motion that you give us counters the stillness of the plantation externally that we see, and the stillness of the wallpaper is that, there's this motion, but your motion almost works against the motion by revealing the motion through how you move the camera, which I think is so lovely. And I didn't know about the choice of the room, but I was struck by homes around this period, the importance of symmetry, and how your choice of wallpaper facing out, which I hope you'll tell us more about because I have so many questions, again, works against the symmetry of the space around it, because you could have put the vignettes, Vues is a series of vignettes, you could have put vignettes in these bracketed loops, but you did not. And so it's, again, it points out more about the wallpaper and yet refuses to accept it as it is at the same time.
I think we have maybe time for one more topic of discussion before we open up to some questions from the audience. And there was a line in Picture Freedom that Amie and I both really responded to, and I think is important to bring up just in terms of thinking about this conversation in a contemporary moment, not as something that is part of history or something that needs to be resolved, but something that is an open conversation. And this is a quote from Jasmine's book: "The transatlantic parlor, through overseeing itself, represents interlocked empires, joined together through collective unease about how to make sense of national identity and Blackness shorn from captivity." And you're referencing in this moment a particular moment in the 19th century, but in reading it at several different points in the process of making this project, it's taken on more and more resonance. And I wonder if you, Jasmine, also you, Amie, both of you, please feel free, have thoughts and being engaged in this work around what level of progress we've made in reckoning with these ideas.
I will say that as much time as I have spent with this wallpaper and its production and circulation, I am consistently amazed at its ongoing relevance and significance.
Yeah.
Both what's in it and how its story about North America's story remains, it's evergreen in a way. Amie and I talked a bit about how recent currents are relevant to the wallpaper, to the production of Amie's work. And I think that would be true almost regardless of how things panned out most recently, right? That there's this way in which this story of the creation of empire on the backs of Black and Indigenous people, and then the settling of that reality into a palatable narrative, it remains consistently important.
Yeah, I would agree and say it's also this disturbingly evergreen.
Yeah.
How the commodification of those stories remains in circulation as such, even if it takes on different forms. What the commodity is, whether it's an image, it's the wallpaper, it's an image of the wallpaper. I mean, there's so many places to go with that, but I mean, that's very disturbing. And it was interesting because when we sat down earlier, when Jasmine and I got together and had a quick drink before we came over here, one of the first things you asked me, what was it exactly that?
Are you okay?
Yes, that's right. After making this project, and I think it was a very empathic question, both in the sense of when an artist finishes a large work, there's always that feeling of just like strange, postpartumness.
Yeah.
But with this project, this was a really disturbing project, and I don't know how long it'll take me to process, but I've sort of have been feeling very odd in the weeks, since finishing it, and I realized that it's because there's just still so much to process in it. But I hope that also the work asks, is demanding those questions of its audience, even though they're tough questions and large questions, that I've somehow been able to turn it over in a larger question as well.
Yeah.
I feel like I didn't answer your question about the paper side of the.
Oh, well, I'll just ask quickly before we go into Q&A. First, I wanted to know, why did they throw it away? What made it unusable? And then was it's a bad turn of phrase here, but good fortune who's disappeared from the image? Or did you have to work on it to remove the characters that don't appear on it?
I did nothing but reassemble it and make a choice about which sections to show. I mean, I should say that I have like 250 rolls in my studio, meaning panels. Mm-hmm. So I took a lot of paper out of the dumpster and then maybe asked for a little more. But we were there at a very particular time. And this was auspicious, I would say, in the sense that this part was auspicious because Zubair was bought by a French family in the 60s, and they've owned it for years, and it's been sort of a sleepy company. And then they were bought by Pierre Frey. And when we went to visit, they were cleaning out the factory, literally cleaning out the attic. So there was a lot of materials that weren't going to be used. And it was just, that's what I mean, it was just an auspicious moment to be there. But I didn't do anything to the paper, importantly, except choose what elements to use, which is, of course, very important. Sure. I mean, out of 250 papers. So I'm saying that because I also believe in the accidental and these sorts of acts of chance that artists have been interested in for a very long time. But at the same time, it was so curious to me, the sort of neurosis or unconscious that we've been talking about, that there it was. It was right there, and it needed to be outlined and set off by itself. And then there are other moments as well, in other papers for pieces to come, let's say.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Amie and Jasmine?
I'm curious about your correspondence with the people who owned the homes that had the papers, and particularly the people who showed up in the film, presenting a table or opening curtains, and how their involvement came to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's a range of homes in the film, and some of these homes have been featured in books that feature the wallpaper, or they've just been published, not because of the wallpaper, but because of other aspects of the home. Others are tremendously private, like you haven't seen them, or they actually one of them is going to be donated to the National Park Service, but that's been a very private home until now. And so, God, I'm trying to reach back into like that part of the project, but you know, this is not foreign to me in terms of the place of asking for permission to be in a private space and to film there as an artist is something I've been doing for a long time. And so
That's how we first met, right?
that's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Because I had met Alexandra, but then realized that she might have some special knowledge of who I could reach out to for a particular project. It was a while ago now, over a decade ago. And she has been someone I have actually consulted on almost every project since, even though this is our first time formally working together.
Secretly.
That's right. Behind the scenes, secret weapon. So in this instance, I think that it, for me, was about, well, there's sort of two levels to this. One has to do with the homeowners, and the other has to do with people who are present in the home otherwise, you know, who are not necessarily the owners, but are working there or, you know, are there tangentially in some other way, or not just homes, but museums or, you know, clubs, et cetera. And so for the former, with the homeowners, I mean, this is just about their level of comfort appearing in the piece, and also how much they wanted to collaborate or participate in the project, really. And my being quite explicit with, you know, in terms of what I was looking at and what I was interested in. Sometimes the homeowners weren't present because it's not their primary residence, or they just weren't there. Many people were just tremendously open, and I'm eternally grateful to them for that. And then with other folks who were there who weren't homeowners and also not my fellow artist collaborators, you know, it's a kind of process of being very open about the goals of the project, and you know, if they had a different positionality in relationship to the history of the space, the home, the landscape, or the wallpaper, then kind of giving them space to either express that or to just say no, you know, which is also fine, perfectly fine. So luckily, though, I think there was just a range of people who were interested, as many as, you know, there were also people who weren't. And you just don't see them because they're said no. So that's, you know, that's how it kind of unfolded in that way. But I also am very grateful to Alexandra, who really brought the connection. You know, I kept saying to Alexandra, oh, we're going to be in Virginia. We're going to be in this one county, far queer county. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. And she said, oh, you should really talk to Devon Tynes. He grew up there. You know, and that was the beginning of you know, the collaboration and relationship with Devon that brought this out. And then him understanding almost instantaneously what I was talking about with those spaces and the wallpaper, and then our unfolding still conversation about what those spaces symbolize and how they act upon us. And then I was also very fortunate when this is all Alexandra suggesting that
Curators making suggestions. Matchmaking.
Not always the case, though, but very fortunate. Suggesting that I speak with Joe, because I was, you know, I had Jasmine's wonderful work to think about the representations of people of color in the paper, but I couldn't find anything really connected to the presence of, you know, indigeneity in the paper. And then it was really curious because, you know, Joe, you're like the best person in the world to talk to about this. Joe had worked also as a curator at a house that had panoramic wallpaper, as well as curated an exhibition on, was it Zubair in particular or Panoramic in general? On Zubair. So like you're like the
What's the house?
Longview? in New Orleans, right? Yeah, Longview House in New Orleans, which didn't end up in the film, but which we visited. So, I mean, these are like kind of amazingly wonderful, like very deep collaborations because of people's very particular and personal knowledge in relationship to this, and also bringing with them their own very specific cultural associations.
And Joe and Devon, not to put you on the spot, but you're welcome to grab the mic and share anything, and if anyone else has any questions.
Please grab the mic.
Yeah, please.
But
So,
Any other questions?
we have time for one more.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Ray has some. Oh, you could do both.
Yeah, maybe we'll do both. I'll just go here and then Marielle.
Sure, thank you. Well, thank you so much for your incredible research, your journey together, and your work. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the production of these wallpapers. Where artists involved, like who commissioned, how was it commissioned? I mean, we know that it was taking place at print places, but and of course it's also, these are like fragments too, and who sort of provided the visual sort of information, like yeah, I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit about like the production of these. I guess the question is to both of you.
Well, I would really turn this over to Jasmine, but I would say one thing, which is that until I picked up your book, I really didn't realize the massive debt the papers owed to printmaking, even though they are themselves acts of printmaking. I was still in the sort of like, it's the moment of history painting and proto-cinema. I was really invested in another visual space in association to the papers.
Yeah. I think that is part of the beauty and I guess kind of misleading nature of the papers, that so they are designed to appear hand painted, but if you look at often a full room, the scenes repeat themselves, and the repetition is due to the seriality that I reference in the caricatures I share. And all of that is about the emergence of printing, early print, starting with lithography, and ways of producing many images cheaply and quickly. And so while the wallpaper that we ultimately get looks like this sort of arduous, very belabored thing that was painted by hand, one image at a time, it is the result of lithography and advancements in printing in the early 19th century that make it possible to not just produce images cheaply and quickly, but to have fidelity over a series of prints that you can get the same image over and over again. And these are about moving from stone to paper, adding chemicals, creating stamps, refining the stamps. And so I think that Zubair's paper is printed with wood block is part of what gives us this appearance of a hand finish. But the willingness to produce that on a mass scale and ensure quality control, the same repetition over and over again, is completely owed to print.
And Detil, as Jasmine's work points out, who was the painter who was commissioned by Zubair to create this panoramic, and I think he did one or two others for Zubair at least.
Yeah, there's the Washington paper. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But I think another one as well. I'm not sure if
There's
it
a
was Vues
few.
of Brazil, but it might have been.
It's another scene. I don't think it's Brazil, but there's another
He clearly, obviously had a copy of, or had a version of Life in Philadelphia.
Yes.
And then there are other
prints
Yes.
that seem to come into play for other parts of Views of North America that we've focused less on in this conversation, like Virginia Natural Bridge or
Yes.
the views of West Point, et cetera. So they have that connection. I mean, one thing that I actually wanted to ask you is, I don't know if we talked about this, but I kind of assumed all along, like before there were panoramic papers, wallpapers were very focused on architectural fragments and elements and the repetition of thus. And yes, they do, panoramic papers repeat, but they take quite a long time before they repeat, unlike most wallpapers where it's like, it's repeating every panel, right? So they're sort of radical for their time in that way. But I sort of figured that, Views of North America is 1834, panoramics start in the early 1800s, and then they just kind of, like the last gasp seems like the War of American Independence, which is the same exact backgrounds as Views of North America,
Yes.
also produced by Zubair, but they put in new figures.
Yeah.
So instead of all the figures we've talked about, there are, it's literally, it's like George Washington and the soldiers and so forth. And that paper did not sell well. And I just kind of assumed that's 1850, and I assumed, it was the Civil War, and that's what ended the popularity of panoramic wallpapers, as people weren't buying them, producing them, et cetera.
Sure.
But then when I really thought about it and went back to your book, I don't know what you think about this theory, but I think it was photography that ended it.
Yeah, I think photography for sure would have just its popularity and availability would have certainly trumped, no pun intended, these particular kinds of representations. And I think this is part of, what's up under this conversation we're having about the contemporary significance of these papers, is that they are historicizing at a certain point. That is a fiction, right? Like they historicize a period that is not actually the period represented in the paper. And very quickly, by 1840, photography is more available, more affordable, a clearer depiction, just, qualitatively better from an aesthetics point of view, that I think would have changed the significance and how compelling these papers are. I think the Washington paper is in a dining room in the White House.
It is. And you can see Pat Nixon giving a tour of it. And sorry, you can see Pat Nixon. I believe it's Pat Nixon. Maybe it's the daughter, but I think it's Pat giving a tour of the dining room with the War of American Independence. I don't know who put it in, and they couldn't tell me when I was there, but I do know that it was covered up later, which we can get into another time.
And it's also, just to say, experienced waves of popularity, right? Over the last 150 years or so, there have been different points at which I think you've been identifying, right? Like when sales jumped. What was it, the 1920s and 30s?
Yeah, exactly, in the colonial revival, right? It became hugely popular all over again. And, originally there were distributors like in Baltimore and Philadelphia and in Richmond, Virginia, who specialized in distributing. You can see the sort of old advertisements for the wallpapers and newspapers, have your scenic, hanging scenics, right? Some of the terms. Yeah, and of course, and then thank you. And then when Jackie Kennedy put it in the White House, boom, that's like everyone is putting it in their home and in their dining room after that. It spawned a huge wave, another wave of popularity that then dies out and it's not popular in the 80s. And then it's back again.
I think you've answered my question already, but maybe I'll quickly pivot with a note of institutional gratitude very publicly for having brought this piece into the space. And I hope you realize also what you're doing to people. You finish the piece, and maybe if it offers any solace in your postpartum for both of you in some way, what it's doing to audiences that come here, because it's both I think you called it a haunting and also an exorcism at the same time. And I think the ones of us who inhabit this space daily are seeing it happen in front of our eyes. But I also hope that you realize the moments of humor that, despite the gravity of the topic, are happening in the galleries as well, that I think are providing a great deal of relief. And it's something that, we need to continue seeing what's going on in the space. But I know we have little time left, but I was very interested in the topic of humor, actually. And as you talked about things.
I think there is humor in the piece as well. Yeah, I mean, certainly the dogs, but if nothing else, right? But I think there is certainly a presence of humor. There's not to say that there isn't.
Do you mean the practice of people painting their dogs into the papers? In their homes?
That would be the most acute example, perhaps, which you have. I think if you have a quick eye, you can pick up on, or you've seen the piece more than once, you can pick up on that. Not just is there a ubiquity of dogs in the homes and the amazingly treasured place that they occupy, which is also curious, but sometimes the dogs get painted into the wallpaper.
The customization.
Yes, there's a kind of a customization. Yes, exactly. A customization of the paper that can happen in its contemporary deployment or installation, let's say. But I was thinking when you said that, though, before about exorcism and haunting, I was just thinking about also thinking again the mediums who are here, who worked with me, and they know who they are. So thanks so much.
Yeah. And thanks to both of you. It's such an incredible example of artists and scholars demystifying our historical and social context. We love you and appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.